Ladies and gentlemen, I am the American Spy Fox. Welcome to the channel. Before we get started, let me say, if you've watched any of my videos, one or two or more of my videos, and you liked them, but you've never left a like, please do so right now. Previously, I've never realized how much likes really count, as far as being suggested to people who don't even know the channel exists. To me, if someone watches the video, that means they like it. They wouldn't watch it if they didn't like it, right? To YouTube, they go by this like system, which is completely ridiculous in my mind, but if you've never left a like, please do so. Moving forward.
So what are we doing?
Just walk and talk.
I imagine this situation went something like this. Dave Grohl calls up Steve Albini. He says, hey, the Foo Fighters are shooting a documentary called Sonic Highways. We'd like to come to Chicago. You give us a tour of your studio and we'll put it in the film. And in classic Steve Albini style, he stops abruptly while they're filming and says, so what do you want me to do? There's no pomp with Albini. There's nothing fake. There's no acting. Even when he knows he's supposed to be acting, he still just can't do it. He is, however, an asshole, and we'll get to that.
Steve Albini. He's one of the world's greatest producer recording engineers. Ta-da!
Steve's reputation is just that he's a cynical prick.
I don't see any real triumph in selling a record to someone who won't appreciate it.
He had that personality that was sort of take it or leave it.
He's very clear about what he likes and what he doesn't like.
When a band is thrust at me and wiggled in front of me like a severed head, it makes me hate them.
He thought that his opinion was fact, always.
All the pomp and circumstance that surrounds music and rock stars could give less than a shit about.
I'm sure that everybody in town wanted to kick that guy's ass at these runs.
The music we make is intended for a select audience, you know, people who will appreciate it, and other people shouldn't try.
So you can easily see why Steve Albini doesn't make very many friends when he comes to town. So why do so many famous musicians kiss his ass?
He makes great records. I don't know how.
He makes great records. I don't know how. Just like I said in part 1, no one really knows the mystery behind his sound or how he achieves it. They call it the Chicago Steve sound. He's especially known for the drum sound he can capture. Most special of all, the snare drum, which is what Kurt Cobain and Dave Grohl were most concerned with when it came to the ambience of In Utero. You gotta remember, Kurt started out as a drummer. He wanted to be a drummer. Even his grandfather, Leland, thought he would be a drummer.
On his musical end of it, we always thought he'd be a drummer because he'd always, every time he'd come over, he'd get a couple sticks, kindling sticks, and he'd beat on our pots and pans. He was always playing on them. His uncle, Chuck Freidenberg, had a band. Kurt used to go play the drums in that. He played them a couple times for the band. During a rehearsal, I guess. He was pretty talented.
Kurt drummed live during a Nirvana concert in Rio de Janeiro. Unfortunately, there's no footage of it. There's audio of it, but I couldn't find any footage of it. Kurt loved the drum sound, the snare sound on the Pixies' Surfer Rosa.
He makes great records. I don't know how. Go to Chicago, let's get Steve sounds.
There's a bunch of bands that he's done all these famous records for.
With your feet on the air, your head on the ground. Wearing purple
a drummer, recording with Steve was a huge deal. That is one of my life's greatest gifts. I got to record with Steve Albini and listen back and hear his drum sound on my drums.
Now, maybe Dave and Steve were just paying each other lip service or whatever, but in the book Come As You Are that you guys always hear me referring to by Michael Azerrad, Steve says that one of the best experiences for him recording Nirvana In Utero was getting to record Dave Grohl on the drums. Steve Albini, quote, "Probably the easiest guy to deal with of them all was Dave Grohl. For one, he's an excellent drummer, so there's never any worry whether he's going to be able to play. Playing was rock solid, and probably the highlight of my appreciation of the band was watching Dave play the drums. He's also a very pleasant, very goofy guy to be around." Hang with me. Albini respected Chris as well. If he listens to something and he doesn't like it, he will say that he doesn't like it, but he's adult enough that he can say, well, this is the kind of thing that might grow on me. I'll let it sit there for a while before I veto it. Albini also feels that Chris has to do a fair amount of mopping up. Like if Kurt doesn't know how to plug in his guitar and tune it, for example, and Chris does, he doesn't make a big deal about it. Albini says Chris will just run in there and take care of it. Kurt had numerous self-appointed minders who would be at his beck and call. Klingons, as Buzz Osborne from the Melvins would call them, and every single one of them was Kurt's best friend. Kurt just didn't have the heart to tell him to off. With this statement about Chris mopping up Kurt's messes or taking care of the hard work that Kurt didn't want to do, what Albini's saying is, yeah, there might not be a lot of pomp surrounding Kurt. He might not dress like a rock star. He might not act like a rock star, but he knows he's a rock star. And if you knew him in your personal life, you'd see how much of a rock star he is. In other words, he's saying Kurt knows his importance. Kurt's a diva, and he's not going to get his hands dirty with any of the bullshit. He's just there to perform and be the center of attention. This is part of the reason Albini isolated the band out in Cannon Falls, Minnesota at Pachyderm Studios in the hopes that nobody else would come around. Or who knows, maybe it was about his own narcissism, his own ego that he is known to have, his controlling nature. Here's the most influential band in the world. Well, who's this guy Steve Albini who can influence the most influential band in the world and isolate them and demand that no one else come around? Maybe it was for his own vanity, for his own reputation. Albini has numerous statements from '93 putting Kurt down, but also being careful to blame outside sources as the cause of what he sees as Kurt Cobain's personality flaws. Let me give you an example. He is an intelligent guy. He doesn't come off that way, Albini continues. He plays dumb occasionally to try to get people to trip themselves up. And I also think he thinks it's cool to be naive and dumb. But I think he's an intelligent guy and he's handled it better than most people would in his situation. Here's what I really think, but don't blame me for thinking this. Blame this other thing. So back in '93, we get a bit of contradiction from Mr. Albini himself. He says, I'm a recording engineer. I'm there to capture the sound. I don't meddle with the band. However, he does like to meddle with the band's friendships, their harmony. Here we see him putting down one guy while talking the other guys up. Comes as no surprise to me that Dave Grohl would end up friends with Steve Albini. After all, Steve had nothing but good things to say about Dave.
This is the control room. Inside here is where all the technical stuff goes on. This is a Neotech recording console made by the Neotech company, a Chicago company. This room is a pretty good example. Some of the Adobe was laid by professional masons, and you can see that the grout joints are very even and very regular. And then some of it was laid by my punk rock friends, possibly after a 3-martini lunch.
Wait, punk rockers drink martinis? I remember drinking Old English and Schlitz and Pabst Blue Ribbon. But I guess when you become a successful punk rocker, you drink martinis.
Maybe that area there.
Beneath this floor, there's another room exactly the same shape. We've separated the floor from the wall, which allows us to couple the air volume in those two rooms together. And that gives you much better linearity in low frequencies because you have a larger air volume. The larger the air volume,
he's brilliant.
The longer a wave you can propagate.
So he sort of affords that reputation of being a cynical prick.
Remember in part 1 when I said no one really knows how he captures that great ambience? Well, it's the air volume and the walls not touching the floor and stuff like that.
There's a whole nother studio on the other side of that wall, which you're not going to get to see because fuck you guys.
So as you can see, people change, people get over things. Friends become enemies, enemies become friends.
I'm not so sure, but I do know that on your first trip, you described Australia as a bunch of inbred, ex-Brit psychos and prisoners back on that first big black tour, and I was wondering if you have a different opinion of us now.
Did I really say inbred?
Yes.
Well, I apologize.
People are resentful of each other one year and they love each other the next. I don't personally think that Dave Grohl or the other guys ever really had any resentment towards Albini. I think it was more Kurt and Chris, and Dave was just sort of going along with the narrative. And the first part of this video, you see the interview where Kurt says, well, we gave him, meaning Albini, $2 million, and then Dave agrees. He says, yeah, that's true. I think that's just Dave going along with Kurt's narrative because Kurt is the leader. And I'm going to explain that whole $2 million thing more later in the video. And it makes sense that Dave would feel pressured to just go along with whatever. After all, if you listen to him talk about his days in Nirvana, he was just lucky to be there.
I could walk in the front door of a Nirvana gig and not really get noticed. So I didn't have to suffer a lot of the pressures that Kurt did as the front man.
When you are the singer, songwriter in the band, you get paid more and you make more decisions. Make no mistake about it. Nirvana was Kurt Cobain's band. He made all the decisions. Just like Dave makes all the decisions for the Foo Fighters. Dave decides where they're going to play, when they're going to play, how much his bandmates are going to get paid for it, everything.
You're the drummer for a band where your singer is the greatest rock and roll drummer in the world, looking over your shoulder, waiting for him to do it as good as him. All right, that's just that pressure. I mean, regardless of how good you are or whatever it is, it's just that pressure. And remember that William was a kid. I mean, he was really young.
I think that William played the best that he could, and sometimes it was great, and sometimes it wasn't.
What sucked about all that was, I mean, I don't think maybe the drum performances were the best. They weren't horrible.
If I listen to a song and I don't think it has the thing that it needs, it's not necessarily gonna get past me and get on an album.
Dave is the leader, so any business arrangements between the Foo Fighters and whoever is going to be decided by Dave, and if any resentment pops up, it's going to be between Dave and whoever. So let's go back to 1993 and figure out who offended who and how In Utero became such a media spectacle. In February of 1993, Kurt, Chris, and Dave pack up their stuff and head to Cannon Falls, Minnesota, to a wintry landscape 30 miles south of Minneapolis in the Minnesota mountains called Pachyderm Studios. Once it was decided that Steve Albini was going to be the recording audio engineer for the world-anticipated next Nirvana album, Steve Albini had a list of demands all of his own. Never mind that none of the guys from Nirvana or people from Geffen ever actually signed that contract, although they did verbally agree to most demands. One of which was Nirvana would bring no groupies, no Klingons, no self-appointed minders, no best friends. It would just be the band, Steve Albini, and his recording audio engineer assistant, Bob Weston. At the time in '93, it was hotly debated by those of us on the outside looking in whether this was Mr. Albini wanting to get down to business and make a true original punk rock record, or whether this was Steve Albini exercising his ego and showing the world what influence he had on the most influential band in the world. The entire recording and mixing process took less than 2 weeks, and afterward Albini would be quoted as saying, "You could put that band in the studio for a year and I don't think they could come up with a better record. I think that's as good as they're going to get." In fact, the guys from Nirvana, including Kurt, would go on to say it was one of the easiest recording processes they had ever done. After all, there was no slick production going on, no multi-track layering, polishing. Most of the takes that you hear on In Utero are the very first takes, a one and done. It is very much Nirvana playing live in the studio. This left plenty of time for the guys from Nirvana, Steve and Bob, to just goof off. around. Remember, these guys are in their 20s, and as women well know, men don't mature until we're like 50. Kurt later reveals to his biographer, Michael Azerrad, that Steve liked to put rubbing alcohol on his ass and light it on fire. Although I do not know for certain, I'd assume that the footage you see is from the 2 weeks Nirvana spent at Pachyderm Studios. It would explain how Dave had this footage for a Foo Fighters documentary, seeing how Chris Novoselic was known to carry a Super 8 around with him and loved to film the guys just being goofy. And it's kind of neat to think that Kurt was standing right off camera while this was going on. When they weren't recording, mixing, or watching Steve light his own ass on fire, they were prank calling Pearl Jam's Eddie Vedder. Albini used his connections in the music world to get Eddie Vedder's personal home phone number, called him up, pretended he was Tony Visconti, a legendary producer who produced acts like David Bowie and T-Rex, convinced Eddie Vedder that he was Tony Visconti. Eddie Vedder bought it. But here's the interesting part, because you need to know a little backstory. Back then, it was always Pearl Jam versus Nirvana. MTV would even play their videos back to back and then allow viewers to call a 1-800 number to vote for who you liked the best, who was the better band. And of course, Nirvana always won. And a lot of people said, Nirvana's not the sellouts, Pearl Jam's the sellouts. They just polish their records to get as much money as they can. So a lot of people think of Eddie Vedder not as an actual artist, but just as a vocalist, a pop singer, just an image. The general consensus was Kurt's the real deal, Eddie's a fake, right? But here's the interesting thing. Steve says to Eddie on the phone, your voice really speaks to me. I want to get you in a real band to do some real recording. Eddie Vedder bought the whole thing, actually believed that he was talking to Tony Visconti, but actually turned it down and said, I'd rather make home recordings of myself and sell them for $5 a pop, which kind of proved that Eddie wasn't the big sellout people thought he was. He wasn't just out for the money, because he believed he was talking to a legendary producer who could have turned him into a David Bowie and turned it down to stick with his band Pearl Jam. Two things, guys. Number one, if you trace Pearl Jam's roots back to the beginning, they derive from Mother Love Bone and Sub Pop's Green River. Number two, there's more prank phone calls I want to talk to you about, and you should know that Albini and the guys from Nirvana recorded these prank phone calls, so somewhere in Albini's f***ing treasure trove of amazing recordings are these prank phone calls. We should all harass him until he releases them to the public. The second prank phone call, also done by Albini, was directed toward none other than legendary bassist Gene Simmons of Kiss. Gold Mountain, Nirvana's management, Danny Goldberg and John Silva, had called the studio and left a message for Kurt, a contact number for Kurt to get in touch with Gene Simmons. Gene Simmons wanted Nirvana to play on a Kiss tribute album, and he even offered to co-write a song with Kurt. And a lot of those 80s superstars were trying to get their foot in the door with Kurt, just like Axl Rose did. They realized they were losing relevancy and wanted to be a part of the new mainstream. They realized that they were being forgotten, so they were trying to kiss Kurt's ass and get involved in this new grunge thing that was going on. Well, Albini just happened to find the number sitting beside the studio phone, called Gene pretending to be Kurt, and basically told him that Kurt was down for whatever with Kiss, which never materialized to my knowledge. And who knows, maybe Gene Simmons heard about the Kiss mural that Kurt drew on the Melvins touring van. Ironically, Kiss and Nirvana would be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame the same year, and Kiss refused to perform. I've heard that Paul and Gene were upset that all the members that had ever been in Kiss were not being inducted and only a select 4 were being inducted. But look at Nirvana. Chad Channing wasn't inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and he's the one who came up with all those world famous iconic drum licks that we hear. Dave is the one who had to give him credit while they were being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Chad Channing. Are you over there, Chad? Hey, Chad. So, here's the thing. Guess what Chad's responsible for? If you listen to a song like In Bloom, that's Chad. I have the honor of playing Chad's parts. So Chad, thank you very much for allowing me to play your drum parts. I appreciate that very, very much.
And personally, I don't think that's right. If you had anything to do with a band's success, whether it's early, mid, or late, you should be inducted right along with them. There is also record of a third prank phone call, which kind of connects to a whole other story that I'll be talking about in the whole series. Evan Dando and his band, the Lemonheads, are on tour in Australia with Courtney Love and Hole. They call Evan Dando up, pretending to be Madonna's assistant. At this point in time, even Madonna is trying to cash in on the whole grunge era. Madonna has invested in her own record company, and she's signing quote-unquote grunge bands. The guys call Evan Dando up, pretending to be Madonna's assistant, tell him to wait on the line for Madonna to pick up the phone. Dando bought it, thinking his band is about to hit the jackpot with a big bonus from Madonna to sign to her record company. And while waiting, and while supposedly being on hold, the guys are listening the whole time. Here's the creepy part. And remember, these phone conversations are recorded. Dando says, "I'm going to start beating off," while he believes he's on hold waiting to talk to Madonna. And if you'd like to know why this is so important and how it connects to Kurt and Courtney in a whole other situation, watch the whole series as they're uploaded. The guys from Nirvana also know that their management, Gold Mountain and DGC, are very nervous about them recording with Steve Albini, this guy who's known for making very raw, warts and all records, imperfect records. So Dave decides to call up John Silva, Danny Goldberg's assistant manager, tells him that everything's going horribly wrong, that Chris was throwing up blood, they don't know what they're gonna do. It puts him into a tizzy. But then of course in the end they tell him, nope, the record's finished, we're all good. Steve, Bob, Kurt, Chris, Dave, they sit around, they have a listening party to the album. Everyone smokes cigars except for Kurt, who sticks to his trusty Winston Lights. Because while Dave was happy with his drum sound, after all, that's what they came to Albini for, and Chris may have been initially happy, Kurt wasn't, and he knew that the album wasn't finished.